downward spiral. And so I think today what we're seeing is very much primarily a spiritual problem, right? First and foremost. That what we're seeing today is definitely a result of God giving us over to our own sinful desires. While in the first century they may have worshipped reptiles and animals, stars, the created things, we are also worshiping the created thing. We're worshiping the self. And so it's very much a spiritual battle. We can't forget that. Nonetheless, there is a logical worldview behind this. And that's what we're after today. So we're going to trace this worldview and go through several series of steps in thinking to arrive where we are today. The first step is what we call psychologizing the self. We think of psychology, the study of the mind, emotions, the feelings, thoughts. And when we talk about the self, what I mean is human, right? What is it to be human? What am I? How do I know what my purpose is and who I am? So the first step in this worldview development is to psychologize the self. And to get that, we go back to the 18th century. And again, there's going to be a history and a philosophy lesson. Don't worry. Just track with me on the major worldview developments. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was an 18th century philosopher. And like all good philosophers, he has famous quotes. Man is born free, and everywhere is in chains, he said. So to understand his philosophy, he did what a lot of philosophers do. He said, let's walk out in the hypothetical state of nature. Meaning, let's pretend the world doesn't exist, society, religion, culture, relationships, and just go where there's just humans in a completely pure society. And he starts to hypothesize about himself in this state of nature. And he says, well, in that place, man is free, but when they come into society, they're actually enslaved. They can't become themselves. We'll get there. And as he's processing himself out in this state, he comes to a few conclusions. First, and most importantly, is that human nature is good. Human nature can be trusted. What is inward in my mind, my thoughts, my feelings, is inherently good and right. And we know he believes this because he gave an example. And it was, I think, a very intentional example. If any of you have read Augustine or not, St. Augustine was a Christian philosopher of the 4th century, and he talks in his Confessions about this moment where he steals pears. And he's with a group of other youths, and they together are deciding whether to steal the pears. And Augustine's reflecting on this moment. And he says, if I was alone, I probably wouldn't have done it. But with the youth, we got riled up and we were all encouraged, and we just stole the pears. And he reflects and he realizes, you know what, my nature is corrupt. I am a sinner who is just corrupt. And of course, this is the biblical worldview of depravity, right, of sin. Rousseau has a similar example. And he says, well, I'm in the state of nature, processing who I am, and I'm good. And there's this moment where he's tempted to steal pears. He uses the same example of stealing fruit. And there was this older guy that he looked up to that's like, yeah, you should do it. I think you should steal the pears. Rousseau's takeaway was, well, I did steal the pears, but only because I wanted to please someone else. In fact, my motive for stealing was good. And I am good. I only did the wrong thing because of something external pushing on me. So according to Rousseau, human nature is good. This is a massive shift in thinking in Western culture that just slowly begins in this Enlightenment rationalism age. Second, because human nature is good, Rousseau said, then we should find our meaning, our purpose inside. We look inward in what we think, in what we feel, in what we believe to find our true self, to find our hope, our meaning, our purpose. And then once I understand who I am based on the inward, then I will live that out to the world. His last conclusion then is, wait, well, what's the problem with the world, right? Every worldview's got to answer, what's the problem? He says, well, the problem is all out there. I'm good, but the world, culture, religion, relationships, society bumps up against me, and that's what corrupts me. This is revolutionary, okay? If you take these three things, human nature is good, we find meaning inward. We'll get to the implications, just track with me. And outward, society, religion is what actually corrupts humans. Now, Rousseau still believed in some sort of universal human nature, some sort of objective standard, you could call it natural law, maybe, that would apply to all humans. So while everyone looked inward, Rousseau still argued for some standard of right and wrong. Well, take us to the next step. The next step, you might say, what the heck is plastic people? Well, I'm really summarizing a book. So these terms are not my own. The book is listed in your resources in the app. Carl Trueman's The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. So if you want to go back and read that book, it will help you. But Trueman talks about the next step in this worldview is that we remove any universal standard to human nature. In other words, there is no guiding principle for all of humans. Humans are plastic. If you understand plastic, it can be shaped, molded, fashioned into any image you want. You just heat it up enough, and it can literally become anything you want. There's no standard at all. And so the next step in this philosophy is to say, okay, we find meaning inward, but we remove that universal standard to human nature. So we next go to Friedrich Nietzsche. He's a German philosopher writing in the 19th century. Nietzsche famously proclaimed, God is dead. Maybe you know nothing else about him than that statement. Maybe you don't know that statement. That's okay. What he meant, he's an atheist. He doesn't mean God is actually dead. He says in society, through our developments of rationalism, enlightenment, we have removed God, the external objective standard, from society, and we've replaced him with nothing. And he says that's actually dangerous, because we at least need something to govern society. Now, he's happy God is dead in his view, because he doesn't believe God and he believes God is oppressive. But what are we going to replace some objective standard, universal human nature? What are we going to replace it with? Well, for him, he builds off Rousseau and says, we must create ourselves. Instead of looking to God for meaning, we look inward, like Rousseau said, and we create ourselves in our own image and throw off all things that hold us back. And for him, it was mostly Christianity. Christianity was what would oppress your true self, because he viewed himself as this intellect of power, of a giant, and what would replace God, he thought, was these superhumans who would create themselves, gain power, and rule the world. Where do you find meaning? You look inward, and then you throw off anything external that prevents you from becoming your true self. And for him, it was really about gaining power. And again, he directly targets Christianity. I hope you see this theme that we're going to go. I'm just starting it now. But this worldview is a direct assault on Christianity. Christianity, he said, is a tool of the weak to oppress the powerful. Ideas like humility, forgiveness, right? The idea that I have to forgive my enemies or even love my enemies, right? Well, that keeps me from becoming powerful. The idea of contentment, it constrains my ambition. So all these things are not true, they're not moral, they're not right or wrong, they're just made up things by those who have power, the Christians in this culture, to keep Nietzsche and other powerful people from becoming their true selves. And so through Nietzschean philosophy, you get a complete disdain for any sort of authority, objective truth claims, God himself. The next step is with Karl Marx. Marx is the founder of communism, writing in the 19th century, and he agreed with Nietzsche, with Rousseau, that human nature is plastic. There's no standard that governs us. There's no right or wrong about humans. We are what we are. For him, we could shape human nature into anything you wanted, but it was primarily dependent on external factors, namely economic ones. Okay, you get that in the communist worldview, everything revolves around economics, money. That's it. So he agrees, human nature has no standard, no objectivity, we can shape it however we want. What he adds is helpful to the discussion is the idea of oppression. For him, for Marx, the whole world was a story of oppression. The rich oppressing the poor, that's it. No right or wrong, no morality, it was just simply the capitalists, gaining wealth, he calls them the bourgeoisie, oppressing the poor, the proletariat. You're either an oppressor or you're an oppressed. That's it. There's no right or wrong, good or bad. You are an oppressor who has money and power, or you're an oppressed who's poor and has no power. This is it. This is the whole world. There's nothing else to it. And he specifically also targeted Christianity. He said it was a tool of the weak, or of the powerful, to keep the weak down, right? Think of the idea of contentment. If you're poor, what does Christianity tell you? God will provide. Be content. There's more to life than wealth. God will provide for you. These are direct teachings from the Bible. He says those are lies. And they keep you, as a poor person, from understanding who you really are, as an oppressed person, who really should realize who you are and rise up and take power and overthrow those in power, right? The lies of Christianity, he called them the opiate of the masses, right? If you get that phrase, it's a drug that would lie to you to keep you from understanding that you are really oppressed. And so, for him, two implications. One, everything becomes political. This is important as we go down the road. Everything's political because economics affects everything. So there's no realm, and you can see this in communist Soviet Union, everything is controlled by the state, right? Because we have to create economic relationships. So just hear me on this saying that Marx adds this idea of everything now is political. There's nothing off limits for the government. How do we find meaning? Well, we look inward. We realize who we really are as an oppressed person. We rise up, throw off the power, and create ourselves into the new ruling class. The last person in this section of plastic people is Charles Darwin, right? And everyone hopefully has heard of Darwin. He posited his theory of evolutionary biology, and basically all he does is add scientific validity to Marx and Nietzsche. There's no purpose to life. Life has no meaning and no purpose. The only, and how, he says it because he explained the world without God, right? God doesn't exist. We have no transcendent objective truth in the Darwinian worldview. We just are. We're just material, the next step in the evolutionary chain. So we have no meaning, no purpose. So when Marx and Nietzsche make their philosophical claims that humans have no purpose, no meaning, and the only way we find meaning is to create ourselves, well, now it has scientific validity. And in the 19th century, if anything had a scientific backing, right, it's accepted. It's more valid. And so that's what Darwin adds to the discussion. So where are we? Right now, in this worldview, what is it to be human? It's to create yourself by looking inward for meaning. Throwing off then oppressive systems, including religion. The world has no meaning. You must create your own meaning through self-creation or class struggle, right? So this is where we are right now. This is about the turn of the 20th century, right? Like 1900. Now, has this worldview made its way into every institution and culture yet? No, but it's gaining steam and continues to do so. That's where we are right now. This is the worldview. Well, how do we get to the point where we are today? Well, the next step is to sexualize the self. Sexualize the self. If the self is who you are is what you feel, your nature is good, can be trusted, your emotions, your thoughts, your feelings are good, that's who you are really. Well, the next step is to say, well, really, what is that psychology? It is sexual. This is Sigmund Freud, writing at the turn of the 20th century. He said that to be human is to be a sexual being. At your core, this is who you are. You are sexual. It's not something you do. Sex is no longer an activity. It's an identity. The self is now a sexual being. He said this is from infancy. If you've read any of Freud or taken classes, he talks about the stages of development, of sexual development. I'll be a bit graphic here to explain his worldview, but he says even infants, literally from birth, are sexual. They start by breastfeeding and sucking their thumb, and this is their sexual activity. Then next, you go 2 to 3-year-old and you learn to control how you go to the bathroom. Yeah, he said that was a sexual stage in development. Then when you're about 3 to 6, the next stage, well, children begin to figure out they have genitalia and explore and understand this. Then there's a latent stage, and then after puberty, you come to full sexual maturity, engage in sexual relationships, and fulfill your true purpose. But for him, it's massive to say this starts right from birth. It's not just something that happens when you get older and you do. It's actually who you are. Again, if the self is the internal feeling and thought and emotion about who you are, for him, the sexual desire was so strong, he said that's actually who you are. That's your primary identity as a person. It's not something you do, it's who you are. And so there's no moral right or wrong with sex. It's just a matter of fact, because it's who people are. There's no questions of right or wrong. We pursue sexual pleasure to fulfill our purpose. because this is the point of life. He went so far as to explain the entire world around sexual repression, what he called it. And I share this isn't so important, but just to try to enter into these people's minds. So start out in the hypothetical state of nature, where there's no religion, no nothing, everyone is free to pursue every sexual pleasure. This would be great, he said. However, there's a problem, right? Like in the animal kingdom, the powerful would eventually win out and be able to have all the sexual pleasure they wanted. Then other people would not. You could see the utilitarian language. But then there'd be a problem. We'd have humans born. How do we care for them? What do we do? And so for him, we started making trade-offs. Okay, well, I can't just have sex all the time because then we don't have society. So we start to add in things like marriage, where, okay, you can fulfill your sexual pleasure here. Marriage isn't something that's good or right or wrong. It just is, so we can actually have a stable, functioning society. So all of society is this trade-off between trying to maximize your sexual pleasure but not have a chaotic world. There's no right or wrong. It's just simply a balance, a trade-off between fulfilling your purpose but having some society. And how do we get the rest of society? Well, when you are sexually repressed and not fulfilling all your desires, then you pursue outlets, whether it be science or art or math. But because you can't fulfill your true purpose, you go take it elsewhere. He said Da Vinci was probably a homosexual, and that's how we get this great art, because he couldn't live out his true self. He makes this beautiful art because he was sexually repressed. I give you that as an example to show how deep this world, it seems crazy, right? It is crazy. That all of society is now built around the sexual desire. This is a massive shift. Now, just think about today. Our world definitely believes that who you are is sexual. Right? It is so clear everywhere you look. I don't need to prove that to you. We're not done though. The next step and the final step in the revolution, we're doing pretty well in time, is to politicize sex. What do I mean by that? Well, there's two other thinkers, Herbert Marcuse, Charles Wright, who politicized sex. Remember, the self, to be human, is first psychologized. You look inward for meaning, right? So instead of something external, objective that I conform myself to, I look inward. That was the first step. The self is psychologized. Then we said, well, the self is really sexualized. We sexualize psychology with Freud. How do we get where we are today? This last step is a combination of Marx and Freud. We take Marx's idea of oppression, but then add it to sex. And that's how we get where we are today. To get here, there was a communist philosopher named Anthony Gramsci writing, he was an Italian philosopher in the early 1900s, and he said Marx was right. Life is just a matter of not right or wrong, but oppression. That's it. But he said Marx was wrong. It's not just material and economic oppression. It's not just the capitalists ruling over the poor. Oppression comes through everything. The ruling people get their power, right? The white heterosexual men really have their power, and they figure out ways to keep their power. And this comes through society, through religion, yes, economics, but everything. Oppression is everywhere, this guy says. This is the basic of critical theory. We talk a lot about critical race theory today. That's just one outgrowth of critical theory. Well, if oppression is everywhere, this guy Herbert Marcuse says that oppression is primarily sexual. If who I am is sexual, but I can't live out my sexual desires in society and in culture, I'm oppressed. You're preventing me from becoming who I am. This is evil. This is wrong. Sexual morals of society, through law, through government, through religion, through monogamous marriage, all of these things, they're not right or wrong. They're made up by the ruling class to oppress me from living out who I really am, which is maybe homosexual, or maybe multiple partners, or maybe I'm a child with sexual desires, but my parents won't let me live that out. These are all oppressive things that prevent me from becoming who I am. We must overthrow them. Of course, this was a direct attack on the family. The family was the most oppressive unit. This bedrock of society for all generations is the tool of the oppressor to prevent me from becoming who I am. Why? Well, it oppressed women. It made women into property who were good for nothing but, reproducing. It prevented them from living out their sexual desires and fantasies. And of course, it was oppressive to children because the family would pass down morals and teach kids and show them sexual relationships and God-ordained, designed monogamous marriage. But this was oppressive, Mercuse said. So what happens, of course, we have to use politics to throw off everything that hinders us. Anything that will hold back my sexual freedom, religion, family, law, custom, you name it, we must unite in our class, rise up and create ourselves to be free who we are. And that's where we are. And of course, then the government grows exponentially, right? Because this involves everything. The family unit, you name it, the state has to intervene everywhere to stop this from happening, so people can truly become who they are, including in intervening in the family. Now the revolution that Marx so desired, right, can be created. We have a much broader class of victims, right? It's not just the economically poor, it's the sexual minorities. You'll hear that term, we'll get there probably next class as we explain some terminology of the trans movement. But we have a broader class of people, of victims who can't live out their true identity because they are oppressed by the systems of man. The last philosopher, and then we'll sort of unpack the worldview, is a feminist. And it is shocking to me and sad that a feminist is sort of the final, nail in the straw to really erase women. Simone de Beauvoir was a French philosopher writing in the middle of the 20th century. And her famous quote is that one is not born, but becomes woman. Doesn't make sense. One is not born, but becomes woman. But it actually makes a lot of sense if you understand the worldview. One is not born, but becomes woman. What are they saying? What is she saying? Well, she's saying that woman, the idea of woman, is really just a construct that society has imposed on women to prevent them from becoming who they are. What do they believe women is? If I believe a woman is a CEO of a company who never has children and has sex all the time, but society says I can't do that, well, I'm being oppressed and I can't become who I really am. So, woman is a construct. So this is where we begin to see the separation of gender and sex. Meaning, sex is biology, what you're born with. Sure, that's real, fine, but that's not really who you are. Who you really are is your internal sense of what a woman is, whatever you think. Society might say you have to live this way as a woman, but that's oppressive. I have to live as a woman whatever way I determine, however I say, without regard to society, religion, morals, right or wrong. Whatever I believe a woman is what I get to live. So she separates sex and gender. Does that make sense? This is huge. That sex is biological, sure, I may have a uterus, but that's not really that important because it's not who I am. It doesn't define my womanhood. My womanhood is what I feel inside about my womanhood, about me, what I think a woman is, and then I live that out. And if that means, well, that I have sex all the time, great, that's who I am. And how do we do that? How do we set women free? We have technology now. And this is the hope of the world for this worldview. You can imagine, birth control revolutionized the world, set women free, abortion, artificial insemination, all these things that now would enable women to become their true selves without regard to their biology. So sex and gender are separated in this worldview. Gender is the internal sense of who you believe you are. Sex is just who cares, biology doesn't really have anything to do with you. It's objective, it's external. Your biology doesn't define who you are. You're defined by what you think, feel, believe. Does this make sense? And that brings us to the worldview that your author, Carl Trueman, calls expressive individualism. To summarize, human identity, which is primarily sexual, is rooted in a person's own internal and psychological view of